I felt a lot of sympathy for Novo Nordisk recently when they pulled out of R&D into inflammatory diseases following some poor phase 2 results. You see, Novo are a great company. They're trying simultaneously to dominate their core business in diabetes, whilst at the same time evolving into a broader based company. So their decision goes to show how difficult evolutionary is for life science companies. And there is a particular piece of evolutionary science that tells us why it's only going to get harder. So let me explain that science before I try to draw out some practical implications. What most of us call evolutionary theory is more accurately described as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. It's a mid-20th century convergence of ideas from several great thinkers. And one of these great thinkers was Cyril Wright, an expert in inbreeding whose parents, coincidentally, were first cousins. One of Wright's most useful contributions was the fitness landscape model. This is a three-dimensional plot of phenotypic traits on the two horizontal axes and evolutionary fitness on the vertical axis. I use these models in my work to display how business models are aligned to their social and technological environments. In simple terms, successful business models are those that are well adapted to occupy peaks in this landscape. Equally, the valleys between the peaks are places of lower fitness. And by and large, the evolutionary process of variation, selection and amplification tends to allow business models to evolve uphill but never down. Just like species, business models that become less fit over time go down the hill and become extinct. And there's the problem. Suppose you're a successful company sitting at the top of your fitness peak and you see the need to move, either because your current business environment is disappearing or you want to occupy a bigger, more profitable peak. To get from one peak to the other peak means going down into the valley, and evolutionary theory doesn't allow for this very easily. Imagine elephants becoming smaller and more vulnerable for many generations whilst it evolved into a horse. Predators wouldn't let that evolving species survive. Or, in business terms, imagine a company destroying shareholder value for many years whilst it invested in a new business model. Investors would soon kill off that company. Now, Cyril Wright, who was talking, of course, about biology rather than business, said that there were two factors that influenced the ability of a species to move from one peak to another peak. In other words, that made the slopes steeper or shallower. These two factors were variation and selection pressures. Variation, that is the variation in practices, strategies, structures and traits, increases the speed of evolution. Strong selection pressures, which punish lack of fitness, slow down the movement from peak to peak. So it doesn't take much to see that our industry, which is highly regulated, incestuous, relatively slow moving, isn't a frenzy of business model experimentation. Similarly, shareholder pressures, intense competition and market access pressures add up to an intensifying selection pressure environment. And our conservative industry and intense competition mean that you have to worry about the ability of our industry to go up and down from peak to peak to adapt to the future. There is, however, a glimmer or two of hope. You see, Cyril's brilliant thinking allows for two shortcuts across the valley of death. The valley of death is an expression that I've often heard pharmaceutical executives use for this. Sometimes one can find a bridge or a causeway across the valley that means not going downhill. And sometimes it's possible to leap across the valley in a single bound by injecting a new clutch of genes from outside, instead of gradually mutating your own genes. So the practical question is, what might bridges and gene injections look like in a life science company environment, for a life science company trying to cross the valley from one peak to another? Well, the bridges are sets of circumstances where variations in the strategies needn't have a short-term cost. So think of this special funding that some technologies get that allow incremental movement from one way of doing things to another. The special payer funds we see for cancer, for example, or government investment in new e-health solutions, are both examples of bridges from one business model peak to another business model peak. And the leaps across the valley, well, that would mean the acquisition of really new, different capabilities from one firm to another by some relationship, merger or acquisition. This is much less common, but some firms are deliberately trying to accelerate that process. So if you look, for instance, at Roche's venture fund, That's a deliberate attempt to find new genes and to absorb them. But both bridges and gene transplants are uncommon and difficult. Wright's thinking suggests that most firms will go down into the valley but won't emerge from the other side. It also tells us that new peaks will still be populated, but perhaps by firms with genes from outside of the industry. So think of Google or Apple, perhaps. And in case you think this is too metaphorical and too abstract, our industry has seen this sort of thing happen in exactly this way before. In the late 19th century, the top of the fitness peak in the farm industry was occupied by the apothecary business model. But they couldn't change fast enough. And the industry became dominated not by apothecaries, but by firms with a history in dyes and coal tar, mostly from the Rhine Valley. Those apothecaries who did survive found bridges or found some way of acquiring genes from the chemist companies. But to end on a positive note, the extinction of the apothecaries was before Cyril Wright gave us maps to navigate the landscape. Today's life science companies have a much better chance of surviving, but of course only if they read the maps that explain how the landscape is changing.